Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to the final session of the Enterprise Connect Virtual Summit, Redefining Customer Experience, sponsored by Tata Communications, brought to you by Enterprise Connect, and broadcast by Informa. I'm Eric Kraft, Program Co-Chair of Enterprise Connect, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. You can download, there's actually, this is just going to be a conversation, so there's not really going to be content slides, but you can download assets in the green resources folder that's available at the bottom of your console and on the left side of your slides window. We do recommend you disable your pop-up blockers. You can submit questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A window. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the live session, but if we don't get to your question, we'll be able to follow up afterwards. Additionally, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please type your issue into the Q&A text area and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. You can also hit the F5 key or on a Mac, the Command R key, and this will refresh your console. So let's get right into our discussion, redefining customer experience. I'm joined here today by Christopher Riccio, Director Consultant Customer Experience and CX Technology at Tata Communications. Chris, welcome.
Hey, Eric, thank you. And thanks everyone for having me on board and welcome to the day. I appreciate the opportunity today.
Well, it's great to have you, and we appreciate your being here, Chris. I want to start out before we jump into the discussion and ask you maybe just to give us a little background on yourself and maybe equally as important, a little background on Tata Communications and how Tata plays in this space of customer experience.
Sure, and thank you for that. So for myself, just give you my background experience. I have 25 plus years in, I want to say contact center, but it really developed from telephony engineering. So I've always had my hands on technology. And so when it comes directly associated with contact center, I've had my hands on the backside for web development applications. And to me, the context of contact center was how the applications come together. Part of my experience has been developing a consulting practice from a point of view of actually working with clients operationally, which is where I believe the best value for transitioning and transforming a contact center is at helping the operations, take whatever products or services they have and develop them into something really useful for the organization. Because it's not very clear that not everyone works from a cookie cutter puzzle, and each one is sort of a puzzle. So aligning their technology with what's available, not selling them new things, but taking the tools they already have to maximize their utilization. So that's my background. I found myself with Tata Communications, and for those of you that have not heard of Tata Communications, we're quite a large global organization, and Tata Communications actually has, I want to say, 8, 9, 10 different organizations. We're well known across the industry, more particularly from a networking point of view. From that point of view, obviously networking transitions and supports any organization. And as we start talking about customer experience and contact center, the ability to go to a cloud organization if you're going from a premise-based product, you're reliant upon the network infrastructure. And that's sort of where Tata Communications shines. To give you some bullet points on Tata's reach in the world, over 30% of the world that routes their internet traffic actually routes through Tata Communications. So when you think about that perspective, 30% is quite a bit when you think about the global world. Now, 80% of cloud giants are connected through Tata Communications. So we do have an infrastructure that supports other smaller infrastructures. So we have a white label functionality as well, but we will support other organizations. But 80% of the giants that you know today route through Tata Communications. Now, switching gears a little bit, and we're going to start talking about customer experience. Tata Communications is the #1 international voice provider. It's sort of our historical value, and we're sort of transforming the industry when it comes to contact center. And we'll talk about that more in detail. But what we're actually offering in that context is that when you're talking about being a global enterprise, many organizations that, for example, have 100 contact centers across 8 countries. Obviously, from an IT perspective, managing the relationships across that perspective can be quite difficult, where Tata comes in to sort of streamline and make things more efficient for folks that belong and control the network infrastructure for orgs, is that we become their PSTN replacement. So if they're dealing with 5, 8 different types of organizations, they can come solely to Tata, and we have a great, robust infrastructure to give them full PST replacement. Now, a couple other bullets that we have that might be interesting to you is we have the world's largest undersea cable system. So we're very robust. We're the premier provider in that infrastructure, and obviously it speaks for itself when it comes to network infrastructure. And when we start talking globally for contact center, it's a big deal. Last couple of bullets is that 300 of the top Fortune 500 companies are actually our customers. So we do work with global players in the multinational space. And so Tata is usually the chosen provider. And under that umbrella, we typically will use the things that are paramount to our success, which is our global network infrastructure, our ease of use with PSTN replacement, and obviously managed services fills that gap as well. So we become the central point for centralization, unification for folks that have very deep infrastructures. And then the last bullet is that we have been the leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant 9 years in a row for network services. So we're known and seen in the industry as a leader in that perspective. So that's us, myself, and Tata.
Okay. Well, and that, I think that all of the different businesses you described and Tata's breadth, I think will come into play as we talk about CX and the contact center, and specifically what perspective Tata brings to that. So I wanted to start out with the title of this session. We called it Redefining the Contact Center. So from your perspective, Tata's perspective, how should the contact center be redefined, and why should we redefine it in the first place?
Sure. So what's interesting is that for those folks that have been in the industry for quite a while, contact center historically had been the vision of folks with headsets like I have on today in a cubicle handling phone calls. But when you look at the big picture of what has transformed the last several years, contact center technology was transforming already. But then we were hit with the pandemic, and everyone, the entire workforce was sent home. But the needs for communication with any organization or service provider that the customer might have, it became critical. And while folks were aware of technology changes and different ways they can communicate with their service provider, whatever that might be, they were sort of forced into taking any sort of channel, meaning communications across web, texting, things of that nature, because getting a hold of people, when you think about contact center providers and agents, as we typically think of it, were also at home. Finding people to communicate became a transformative experience. And I do think through the pandemic that the acquisition of learning customer experience really broadened. Now, in my mind, contact center and customer experience have all switched to that viewpoint. Customer experience takes the totality of the customer's experience across your org. And that could be anyone from the security guard that opens the front gate, the receptionist, in my opinion, anyone that touches the customer at any level becomes part of the customer experience. And I think folks are starting to realize that the sort of metrics they've historically watched in the contact center, and I'm using air quotes, has changed, because now we need to include and encompass anyone that actually impacts our brand. Because the reality is that when you go to an organization, your experience at every level is going to impact your perception of who they believe you are and where you'll take your services. So I do think contact center with technology itself has afforded the ability to completely transform it. So now we have this collective mass of customer experience. And when we talk about customer experience, it's very broad and deep, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a few more questions, but that's how contact center has changed from that perspective. It's no longer folks in cubicles and headsets. It's really transformed.
Got it. So that's sort of describing how it's transformed and how it's being redefined. Do you have some examples that you could share with us about some use cases, either Tata customers or just use cases you're familiar with, that kind of illustrate this redefining?
Yeah, so let's be realistic about contact center. And for the folks that have the experience, the number one issue with contact center has always been staffing, and it will always be staffing. And then with the influx of activity and the different ways that customers are expecting to communicate with an organization, how we translate, how we communicate with somebody had to give it some way, right? So when it comes to use cases, rather than think of an agent who typically would answer phone calls, we have to think more in lines of, okay, we have to look at the perspective of what is the customer looking for and what's the best way to handle it. And to be frank, if you're like myself, I'm a pretty good customer, but I also know what technology offers. And when I'm looking for information, I may not always need to speak with somebody. What I'm really looking for is a quick hit to get information. And so what's really changed in the contact center is that your agent, who is primarily your brand of your organization, was used for everything, whether the customer was I will say not as diligent in looking for information. They just took the easy way out and wanted to call you. But there's information that's readily accessible to folks. And so as folks start looking at how are our customers reaching us, what information are they looking to obtain for us? And the critical question is, how much of that information can we make available to the customer as they contact us, either in an automated way, a proactive way, without what I want to say, being sensitive to customers' needs. And so I think when we looked at technology, it became a critical way for us to say, wow, through the pandemic, which is the easy example, I used to have hundreds of calls a day. Now I have thousands of calls. I've got to filter that because I don't have enough people. So I've got to deploy a smarter way to handle the queries. So from a use case perspective, let's say you're a travel guest and you're going to go on a cruise. And obviously, if you've ever traveled, you have certain things you're looking for. You're looking for your itinerary. You're looking for your touch points. Hey, you're looking for which is the best restaurant on the cruise ship. These are information pieces that are usually available to somebody. And it's that type of information which is readily available has been now sort of moved into a segue that if that person contacts us, calls us, is there a way to identify that user, take a look at their itinerary and offer them, without them having to ask, ways for them to obtain information that might be critical for them. So when it comes to the transformation of the contact center, there is some work that needs to be done in terms of how we filter that out. But I will tell you, hands down, most contact centers that I've worked with in the last 25 years is you have what I call busy bee work where the information is readily available to the customer. So is there a better way for us to make it available to the customer without a lot of effort? And so I think folks are trying to split their minds in terms of what do we make available in an automated way, in a proactive way that's sensitive, but also, and this is the real critical piece, how do we make it easy for the customer to opt out of that option to speak with somebody? I think that early on when contact center was changing, giving people the opt-out option was also critical, and I think that's part of the equation as well. The last comment I'll make is that when we look at the agents and our support for contact center and securing our brand, we have to sort of think about what is now being called agent disposition. Primarily, what I mean by that is agents were always the holy grail of your information. They held all the knowledge. But now if we're splitting information off in a more proactive, intelligent way, your agent's mindset changes. They become more resident experts for real issues. So let's say you have 100% of calls come in, 80% are handled through automation, but the 20% who actually go to somebody, they're either a critical mass, a complex inquiry, and so your agent is given more power in terms of intelligence about being an expert for what they bring to the table. Now, I know that's a broad answer, so hopefully that gives a perspective because
Sure.
It can be quite wide.
Sure. So, I mean, to that last point, sort of empowering the agent in those 20% of cases to be more, to sort of be a higher value asset to the customer, and for that matter, being proactive or trying to make the right kind of information available to the customer if you're trying to push them towards self-service. All of that seems to revolve around the data, not just the data, the contact center data, but all the data that the enterprise, all the customer data that the enterprise has. And we hear a lot now about kind of data integration and bringing more of this data to bear in the contact center. What's the right way for enterprises to kind of go about trying to do this data integration, and sort of what constituencies are involved, and what's kind of an approach that an enterprise can use to try to get a better handle on this data and to bring it to bear more effectively?
Sure, great question. And I always answer it this way that, we tend to look at sort of how marketing positions data. And if you remember about 7 years ago, there was a big push on big data. But the reality is we've had data for years and centuries. Everyone has a collective list of either their patients, their customers, et cetera, somewhere, right? So this information has always been available. But using the information to help create a better experience is critical. And so, Eric, you asked the question about how our customers or clients using the information. First, I'll say when you start to bring in more advantaged technology, one of the most critical pieces is that if the customer navigates through different branches of your process, whether it's hitting your website first, then going into an AI engine, artificial intelligence, and then move into IVR, the most critical mistake we can make is not having that data trail with us all the way down to when if I actually opt out, please don't re-ask me the information you've already asked me for or that I've given. So that information has to be collected. Now, what I see is folks that look at data is that oftentimes, and if we're realistic, most folks are dealing with a lot of legacy applications. And contact center has always been seen as a separate application. And rightfully so, it's separate software, but in reality, it's more of a contextual piece. The contact center has always had a need to be attached to data, and I think we've learned that in the contact center slowly, and it's certainly become critical over the last couple of years. And when folks were originally making acquisitions for products and services, the one thing they would focus on for the contact center was what's my agent experience, what's my supervisor experience, because obviously we want the user experience to be comfortable. Because I always say this, the more complex the application is at the desktop, as I'm working with a customer, means that your agent is distracted. If they're focusing more on juggling an application, they're not focused on customer experience. And the one thing I would say when folks are looking to acquire applications, the part that I see where folks sort of stumble a bit is that the user experience, they'll buy something that looks great for the user, but they haven't really looked at what does it take to create the integrations. And so consequently, when they purchase a product that is going to be beneficial for the user, at least at one degree, on the backside, they end up spending 3 times the product for development just to get the integration. So a lot of folks will focus their sole efforts on what's the user experience, which is critical. But the piece that needs to happen is you need to focus on the pillars of any solution. And my go-tos are, what are my services and what is required to do a web service? And let's be honest, it's 2023 almost. In my opinion, plug-in functionality is a real deal. And there are applications today where I can just point and click and have a ready built or ready to configure web services. So what that means is development doesn't have quite the uphill battle. And so that's one of the things that folks forget about. And I do think that accessibility to information is going to be a game changer for anybody as they go forward. Now, the critical piece is that piece of information that we're looking to gain access to, whether it's just CRM, a patient portal, a database application, and actually everything, in my opinion, is a database application. Where else can we use that information? We want to use it across any channel, AI, et cetera. So it's one of the pillars I think that often gets overlooked, but it's a critical part to the success of the folks on the front side. Now, the last point I'll make on the data aspect is not only do we want accessibility to data, we absolutely need the reporting. We need to know where the customer's been, what's their experience been, and how do we funnel that back into either a user experience application for a supervisor or for a BI team. When you start tracking customer journey, we need to know at what vantage points and where are the obstacles and bottlenecks in the processes we believe were built well, because we'll always need that data to isolate issues. And I know that's a long answer to access for data, but that's one of the things that I think folks forget about is that when you're looking at the nice stuff on the front side, don't forget about the accessibility to data and how much effort is needed to make that happen.
Well, it's interesting. In our keynote session that opened our summit here today, Mila D'Antonio from the research firm Omdia presented some Omdia data showing when the question was posed, what are the greatest obstacles to data integration? Organizational silos ranked number 1 on the list. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like, you're saying there's not a lack of technology to do these integrations. It probably is a situation where the enterprise needs to do something more different or better to get everybody going in the same direction.
Yeah, and that's the real critical part. I don't want to discount the fact that their data's in separate places, and I'll say this out front. I don't ever recommend hitting the raw data. Usually somebody in the organization is doing a level of analytics, so they have a staging table of key data. That's the data I think is more critical or easier to get to. When you're dealing with siloed data, we do have to sometimes go through deciphering the difference between legacy data. And a lot of organizations I work with, they're hung on to their legacy data because that's always what they've done. I have a use case now. A customer was really attached to their old data. It took us about 6 to 8 weeks, but when we finally showed them there's other ways through API and a tool that was designed to make data universally available at any branch, once they finally got there, they were like, wow, I didn't know that was available. But to your point, yeah, when we start dealing with silos of data, we do need to bring to the table a tool that allows us to access the data at any point so that we can adhere to the restrictions that people have on their data. And there's always going to be that to deal with.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, so to kind of move on, a lot of folks who look at the contact center from the IT perspective think in terms of the technology, the enabling technology. So I want to kind of ask it in terms of, as a company that consults in this space and that does managed services in this space, you've kind of got this universe of CCaaS, cloud-based CPaaS, increasingly being used in contact center applications, and then the kind of UC as a service, or UCaaS, that is sort of adjacent or aligned with the contact center. Mm-hmm. So how does an enterprise think about putting those technology pieces together to provide the framework to do all this stuff we're talking about?
Oh my gosh, this is a great question. So here's what I would say. UCaaS or PBX, if I go old school, has always been around. And you have contact center or CCaaS. And then now you have CPaaS, which is the communication platform as a service. Now, what's interesting is that, let's talk about UCaaS for a moment, and I'll give you an example that helps kind of marry the story. UCaaS is usually dedicated to having communication sources just so I can get to the business, right? Then you would dissect that into a contact center, which would be a separate entity. So you'd create a silo just for that sort of services. But you also had parts of the business that aren't really contact center type of scenarios, but they can benefit from contact center technology. But do they need the whole shebang of contact center? The short answer is no. You have things like business development on the UC side, or the sales team that's outbound only, that aren't necessarily going to be using a automated system for dialing because they're working from a portfolio or inside their CRM. But you have the needs to communicate or extend the branch of communication beyond just a phone call or email. With text capabilities and then bringing other products to the table so that clients can get you, this is where CPaaS marries very well. Now, CPaaS, excuse me, has an overlay and can be a contact center-like application. It does provide the functionality. However, CPaaS doesn't have the restrictions in contact center in the terms of where we're dealing with queues and agents and typical KPIs. Instead, CPaaS becomes an overlay that says, well, how do you want to drive my communication? Are you at a client base and you want to do a regular touch point with a customer? Maybe it's your VIP clients. If you can't do a voice conversation, can you reach them by text message? And if someone should respond, when they respond via text, and most people these days see and respond to their text more readily than a phone call. When the data returns, are we gathering the data to maneuver that person to the right entity, whether it's on the UC side is what I'm talking about here. The other advantage with CPaaS is it sort of blurs the lines between the need for a relationship management from an account perspective or even a sales perspective. It blurs the lines with data. There are events that happen with your data that are great trigger points for sending notifications to customers, whether it is, hey, here's our sale for next week because Christmas is coming up, or here's our new product release that just came out that you may not be aware of. These are things that don't necessarily need a contact center, but it needs the CPaaS triggering event to send out the communication. And I think most folks realize that when you're trying to protect your brand, anything you can do to keep associated with your customer in a proactive way changes their perception of how connected you are to them as an individual. So CPaaS blurs that line. Now, I do have a lot of folks who live and breathe on UC or Unified Communications, and they would never do contact center. But CPaaS becomes an overlay for them to allow and have contact center functionality in a different way that can still work on top of their existing legacy UC. Now that is changing, but that's where CPaaS fits. Now, switching gears to contact center. Contact center has all these tools, and a lot of it has an overlay with CPaaS. So, for example, you have artificial intelligence. That's paramount to contact center these days. It's just standard. And you have things in a contact center such as campaigns. Either you're sending out notifications. Maybe you have a school outage or a closure because of weather. And so you need to send 1,000 messages to parents that school is closed tomorrow because of weather, those types of things, right? You don't necessarily need contact center for that, but typically you would use a contact center to send that sort of communication. But this is where I see CPaaS overlays into contact center to extend that branch. Now, to give you a use case, I'm going to marry these all together. I do have a customer who is in life preservation. So if somebody's, for example, waiting for a kidney, and the only way that person's going to get a kidney is that if someone passes away. Well, maybe somebody in a hospital who's in charge of the care facility realizes, hey, we have a patient who is a donor match for X, Y, and Z person. They can call into the contact center. But what happens there is, as they place the call, they get the security, the authorization, but then a CPaaS node goes out to the family and to the person managing the family while still contacting the folks who are going to do the ambulatory services and coordinating the medical pieces on the back end. This is where CPaaS overlays the pieces together and gives us a better experience. Now, I have plenty of examples, but I'll stop with that. But in today's world, you know, UCaaS, CPaaS, and CCaaS, yes, they're separate. But in my opinion, they're not separate. They belong together, and how you bridge them depends on what is your level of effort and initiative for each branch of the business. Because I have seen in one organization, we will have nurses on a contact center, we will have care facilities on the contact center with an overlay to a clinic using CPaaS, and then we have the account managers who want to know when someone's called in that their premium customer is having an issue. So the three pieces layer together, and obviously the data is the most critical part.
Got it. Totally makes sense. So I want to close with a question that's in a little bit of a different direction, but I think it's getting to be more of something that people are aware of and concerned about in dealing with contact centers, and that's security and specifically authentication. That's something that when we were chatting earlier, you indicated that authentication is a really important part of what Tata offers and what you bring to market. Why is it so important, and how does it improve security?
Sure. So one of the most important things, I'm holding on my phone. We all have an Android or an iPhone or some mobile device. One of the hardest things for anyone, if you're looking at high security environments like healthcare where you have HIPAA compliance, or it could be collections, a collection industry, or somebody in a bank, you know, authentication and authorizing the person is critical. Now, there are great applications out there. There's Google Authenticator. There's also Microsoft Authenticator. And the way my company works and what we do at Tata is that we use facial recognition in our translation. So when I go to log into my network, I actually get a notification on my cell phone. When I click the yes, it actually does a facial scan to confirm who I am and then authenticates me. Now, I'm seeing folks use ancillary products, and I want to be clear here. There are standalone products that don't require the full contact center that can be dedicated just to authorizing the person you're speaking with so that when they finally get to somebody, they've already been qualified. I've seen this using healthcare and banks predominantly, but this is where I think that technology is there. And what we do, Tata, is that we use our CPaaS application and marry it to other applications in order to give us a collective experience. Because I think one of the most probably painful parts of going through a secure environment is going through the whole security process and answering all the questions. And so it does simplify it. But authentication is a big deal. And when it comes to a security point of view, there are ways to work it through that. And it could be visualization through a facial scan, or it could be voice biometrics. That's what's on the forefront and what people are looking towards. But that's ways we can simplify that process. And of course, you'll notify the agent that the person has been qualified, they are who they are. And perhaps maybe on their screen, you still do a little pop-up. Okay, they've done all this information, but still ask them this 4-digit code. And that's actually what happens with me when I go to GoDaddy. Even though they know me, they still send me an SMS text. So, you know, it's a game changer. And I've seen some very painful experiences on authenticating users.
Cool. All right. Well, that brings us just about to the end of our time here. So, Chris, I really appreciate the conversation. It's been really a great look into, to the point we're talking about, redefining the contact center and redefining customer experience. And I think we saw some great examples of how we're well on the way to doing that. And so, thanks very much for your time. Thanks, of course, to the audience for attending this session. This session was sponsored by Tata Communications. It was presented by Enterprise Connect and brought to you by Informa. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a follow-up email with details and give you a link to the virtual presentation, so you can pass that link along to other people who might want to tune in to the replay. The session is copyright 2022 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Enterprise Connect, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their operations. So on behalf of Chris Riccio of Tata, thank you very much for joining us. This does conclude our virtual summit. Thanks, Chris. This was Building Customer Experience for the Next Generation. I hope you found it informative and useful. On behalf of all of our speakers today, I'm Eric Kraft. Thanks for your time, and we'll see you at our next virtual summit in 2023.